Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Onchain India podcast. We have Teemu from Gevulot with us today. Gevulot is building an amazing decentralized compute network, which is specifically optimized for ZK proof generation and verifications. They had an amazing fundraising journey where they've raised more than $6 million from some tier one VCs in the world. So we're going to deep dive and hear from Teemu on all the aspects of Kevlot and also their future plans. Welcome to the Onchain India podcast team.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So Teemu, let's deep dive into your background and your journey into the crypto. Would love to hear more about it.
Sure. Yeah. So I got my start in crypto in college. This was maybe 2011, 2012. So I got interested in Bitcoin back then, and then during my university, we started like an exchange or a Bitcoin exchange here in the Nordics. And I did that for a little while, and then we ended up selling that to a competitor. Then I spent some time advising, investing in different projects, sort of between like 2015 and 2018. So, for example, I advised Dapper Labs back before they launched CryptoKitties. That was a long time ago. Many people won't remember or won't have been around then. But CryptoKitties was a funny thing. You can Google it. It basically broke Ethereum for a little while. And then in 2018, we started Equilibrium, which is now Equilibrium Group, which is basically the company focuses on like low-level protocol development. So we do core development for a number of different networks. Basically all the big names. We've worked with the Ethereum Foundation, with Protocol Labs, with ZK Sync, Starknet, Celestia, etc. And Gevulot was a project that started inside Equilibrium, and really it started because we sort of saw that the rollup projects really weren't thinking about proving and how they were going to do proving, and they were completely centralized at that point, and they were trying to figure out like, okay, are they going to be doing decentralized sequencing? But they were just not thinking about proving, and so we thought we would take a stab at that. And then that evolved into Gevulot. So Gevulot is basically a universal proving layer for zero knowledge proofs. Anyone can use it. You can think of it as a decentralized cloud. Like the purpose is to collect the most like efficient and lowest cost structure hardware from around the world and bring that to bear in generating zero knowledge proofs, so we can lower the costs of proving considerably and make all these ZK applications, ZK rollups, ZK coprocessors, things like that, much more viable economically and much more competitive with alternative solutions.
Got it. So Timu, wanted to have your opinions on you mentioned some background activity on the Equilibrium project and how it shaped out. But one of the key things for early stage developers is while choosing and finalizing the idea, right? Because you have a couple of them, you feel everyone can hit like a big thing, but
Yeah.
what is the mental model that you used for in incorporation of Kaplot, and what would be your advice to founders who are still in that phase of choosing the concepts?
Yeah. So within Equilibrium, we worked on a whole lot of different ideas. I can talk a little bit about how we approach these things and also how I approach these things. So I think the very obvious piece of advice that I give every time, but even though it seems obvious, most people don't do it, is just talk to customers or potential customers immediately. Like, don't even build anything. Talk to the customers first, and see how they react to your idea. And then from there, like, you want to like immediately start building this feedback loop with your potential customers or the people you think would be the most likely to pay for whatever you're building. And then kind of at each stage of iteration, you go back for more feedback, and you kind of try to navigate the design space via this feedback loop. So it's not that the customer is always right, but the customer will certainly be able to tell you if they think this is totally not useful for them. And then the other thing we kind of think of, which is sort of related but not quite the same, is I like very much operate on signal. So as you kind of start spending more time with an idea, or you get like some indication from customers that maybe there's like demand for this, and maybe you're looking at the narratives or how the market structure is evolving, and you think there's going to be space for someone there or a product there, then you look for kind of signal as you go along to increase the usage of resources. And so this sort of applies to startups, but it applied to Equilibrium even more because we were committing internal resources to working on this. And so, we don't want everyone in Equilibrium who are working on all this other stuff to be working on Gevulot if there's no signal that it's going to be a good thing. And the same thing in a startup. So you have some amount of funding. Don't do the thing that happens a lot in crypto, where you build up an whole organization before you have product market fit. That happens so much. It's really dumb. So there are companies running around which employ 100 people and they still don't know exactly what they're doing. Don't do that. Like, sort of, even if you get funding, kind of treat the funding as like this external thing, as if it's like your capital and you're thinking about how much to commit to this work, and only start sort of expanding your commitment as you get more and more signal that you're going in the right direction. Because if you're not going in the right direction, you need that funding to last for a very long time, so that you can explore other directions or whatever. And so I think that's kind of the way to think about it. And then on a very sort of practical level, I would always just look for kind of areas of the industry where there's huge amounts of people building, and I would not go there. So I would like, for example, I could easily say this from the context of like the ZK industry. I don't think anyone should be starting ZK infrastructure projects. There might be some that totally make sense. So I'm not saying that like don't do that. But certainly if you're kind of exploring and looking for ideas, I think the ZK sort of application level is much more ripe for new things. There's not that many things happening there. A lot of the infrastructure is getting better now, and it's not super competitive. So you're like, less of the design space has been explored. So you always want to look for places where there's quite a large design space, and not that many people exploring that, because that's usually where you would find something that no one else has thought of, or no one else has done very well, or whatever.
Got it. I think this is a very sage advice, and a very practical one. Because considering a lot of parameters which the founders have in their initial phase, so it's always exciting. Timu, let's jump on to the Gevlot part of it. I think there is some excellent kind of work that you guys have been doing, and couple of more product suits like Gevlot Deluge and different things. So would love to have your thoughts on what is the end game over here.
Yeah. So I just quickly to go kind of over what kind of our roadmap. So we just launched Gevulot Firestarter. Gevulot Firestarter is like a permissioned version of the network that's intended for production workloads. And so we have all these customers who really want to start using it, but after our mainnet launch, it's going to take a little while for mainnet to be really stable and reliable. And this is all sort of mission critical stuff. So like if the proof doesn't get generated, the roll up or whatever, like they're in trouble. So it really needs to be super reliable. And so we started, or we built Gevulot Firestarter, which is basically the same implementation. as our mainnet is going to be, but that's sort of run in a permission form to make sure that it's stable and consistent for our clients. The next step is sort of like a test net where we test out having a lot of different validators. So that's going to be a separate instance from Firestarter. Firestarter is going to keep running, and then after that, mainnet. So that's kind of like the trajectory we're on. And so mainnet is being planned for Q1, Q2 next year.
Got it. Can't wait to see the mainnet and the kind of response you get from that. I think it's a very interesting time to launch a fully fledged working kind of products in this environment. And
well, if I can touch on that, I think there's so our specific network I think is somewhat unique because it's really like a B2B business, right? Like we're like AWS and we're selling compute, or the network is AWS and we're selling compute to all these different projects. So it's quite different, I think, than a lot of other sort of blockchain projects out there. Like it's not consumer facing in terms of its utility, but then at the same time it has like an actual business model which is not consumer driven. So even in a bear market, rollups still need to generate proofs, right? And so you have this constant sort of flow of these different projects needing to purchase a token to pay for compute, and I think it creates a very interesting dynamic. Maybe there's some analogies like Filecoin or something like that, but I think most things that are similar in the past, they haven't had as clear of a customer base or a use case. And so I'm very fascinated to see how this goes, because it's for like a retail user, there's nothing they can do with our network besides stake the token. But at the same time, like if you sort of are a part of that community, you are a part of like building out this sort of B2B business. And I think that's going to be a slightly new thing, and I think it'll be quite compelling for people. But it does make it sometimes tricky to talk about, because it's like how many retail users care about this sort of like back-end cloud service.
Very true, very true. I think I mean, the tech innovation and the retail, I think, I don't know when it will converge, but it should definitely converge at some point to truly respect, the innovations, that are going. Okay, coming back to, the most important aspect on the fundraising, Teemu, right? I think early stage founders, when they're raising their first round, it's very hard to get the first check, right? I mean, when they talk to a lot of VCs, the general answer is, have you got the lead? And when you speak to lead, there are very limited players in the industry where you can actually go out. So couple of questions in this. How was the framework for you to raise for Gevulot? And what would be your advice where you feel that founders can follow this couple of practical steps to ensure, they complete it in the right time?
Yeah. So fundraising is definitely always difficult. I think so. In an ideal world, you're just never in a position where you absolutely need money. Like you never end up in an existential kind of situation. So the best position to fundraise from is one where you could just decide, no, I'm not going to do this after all, and you would be fine. We had this situation because we were kind of like backed by Equilibrium Group. And so obviously this doesn't apply to every situation. But if you, for example, raised your seed round, try to extend that runway long enough, and then try to raise before you're running out of runway. That's kind of like or should be kind of the optimal way to do it. In terms of actually like closing rounds, I mean, there's all this sort of like Y Combinator basic advice, like talk to all the investors in a very short period of time. They always back channel with each other. So you want to create the impression that everyone is looking at it, everyone is talking about it, and that sort of thing. My personal sort of thing is also I never use decks. Like, you can have a deck, but I never like present a deck when I'm on a call with investors. I just chat to them. But there's different styles for doing that. But ultimately, like, it's important to understand kind of like the higher level fundraising structure, right? Investors get very excited about something, and they all get very excited at the same time. Ideally, they're very excited about your thing right at the time when you're fundraising. But ultimately, timing doesn't always work like that. They get excited about something else, or there's just like some macro financial conditions, which mean that they're like more hesitant to deploy capital. And so when fundraising, you're always at the whim of these many forces which are not really under your control. So I don't know, this is maybe not the best fundraising advice, but like my advice would be to try to, as quickly as possible, get to a situation where you don't need to fundraise. So in some instances that's revenue. Like even if you don't have that much revenue, if you can like sustain a minimum viable team on that revenue, that's already freedom. Like you can have a bigger team, but like if things go wrong, you can always decrease the size of the team a little bit and survive. And then when you fundraise, like try to fundraise a little bit more than you need. Investors obviously want to give you exactly the amount of money you need for the next 18 months or something. Ideally, you get more than that. Things go wrong. You don't want to be fundraising immediately again, especially if you're in a very early stage. The founder is going to be a part of every single thing the company is doing, and for that founder to be away fundraising for many months, like is very difficult. So I think, like, to sum up, like, try to not need to fundraise. Of course, you probably need to at some point, but like try to take steps which lead you to a point where you no longer need to fundraise as quickly as possible, and then you can fundraise all you want, right? Then you can be like, well, if somebody gives me these terms, then I'm happy to take money, but we don't need it right now, so I'm not going to go out of my way, and I can just focus on the business. Most things don't actually require that much money. So,
Very
I mean,
true.
especially in like if you're in regions like India, like the cost structure is completely different to what it is in the US. So if you can raise like a small US round, that's a big round in India, I would imagine. That's like a small US round is even a big round in Finland. So there's all these kind of like geographical arbitrage opportunities.
Got it. Timo, a follow-up question on this is a lot of founders, especially when they raise the first round of funding, the next practical steps becomes how do they plan their GTM strategy, or how do they grow from 1 to 10 kind of a journey. And given our Web3, a bit of chaotic industry, it's very hard when to plan the token, see what the regulatory aspects comes in, battle the cycles and stuff. So how is your strategy being, from last few months, post fundraising, and will also advise, founders going through this kind of phase?
Yeah. So I mean, go-to-market strategy is always different for every company. I think it depends on the people at the company. It depends on the product. It depends who your customers are, etc. So it's very hard to give kind of general advice on that front. Um, like the way that we have done it is like we I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but basically like we mainly went first to the customers. So I think in the first, let's say 6 months of like, so we announced the initial design. I want to say November last year. Then we launched the DevNet in March. And in those first 6 months, I think we talked to 300 different potential customers. So that was kind of our approach, and we only started doing more sort of like a more broad go to market much later on. And that's because our product is that way, right? If our product was like for end users, then we would need like then the first 6 months would have been talking to end users and trying to make them be your champions and get really excited about it. But yeah, I mean, crypto go to market is always tricky. It's very, very noisy. If you happen to be the kind of person who, I don't know, is like very interesting to listen to or loves getting into fights on Twitter, then that's potentially a viable strategy for getting noticed. But I think for a lot of people, like it's enough to just approach this in kind of the same way that you would approach anything else. You just talk to customers, talk to investors, then try to communicate the benefits of your product to a broader audience using things like social media or podcasts or whatever. So I mean, it's not rocket science, but it's hard to stand out because there's so much noise.
Got it. Teemu, as we are closing end to this podcast, would love to hear what are your top, two other sectors that you feel fairly connected, apart from ZK, because I know you're deeply very passionate about it and building. And a follow-up thing is, what are some interesting concepts that you feel or predict that 2025 these concepts can really play out? Just an inspiration ideas, for few folks.
So these are blockchain sectors.
Yes, blockchain, Web3 only.
Yeah. So it's probably going to be a big bubble, but I'm actually quite excited about on-chain AI agents. We've started seeing them on Base, and we've seen them on Solana. And I think that they're really interesting. Right now, of course, they have tokens, and then those tokens kind of trade like meme coins. And that is fairly likely to be a bubble of some kind. But on the other hand, those agents are building genuine audiences, which have legitimate value in and of themselves. And I think they'll continue to improve quite dramatically. Like I don't know what a time frame would be, but I suspect AI influencers will potentially become bigger influencers than human influencers over some time period. So I'm really interested in that stuff. Definitely not investment advice. Like said, it's probably a bubble. But there's a lot of stuff going on in that kind of intersection, and I think there's still quite a lot of opportunity. So for anyone who's interested in taking a look at those things, there's a protocol on Base called Virtuals, and then there's AI16Z or ELIZA on Solana. I've played around with those frameworks, and they're quite cool. Very easy to get something up and running, and start exploring that side of things. So there's that. In terms of other sectors, I don't know if this is really like a very useful one to look at. But it seems so. There's these projects like Hyperliquid and Mega ETH, or maybe more appropriately just Mega ETH. So which are what are known as like validiums. So they're like single server things, but they gain some security from Ethereum. Hyperliquid, as far as I know, doesn't do that, but like conceptually they perform the same kind of function. And the idea there is just like maybe with some security from Ethereum, we can just get to like way higher performance because it's basically a centralized system. And you can think different things about whether that makes sense from for the decentralized industry. But I do think that we like on things like Mega ETH, you'll be able to do things which you just simply cannot do anywhere else. And so I think that's also open design space. Is like, okay, if we have legitimate like 200 millisecond response times, which is like under the window of human recognition, if everything is dirt cheap, then like what can we do, and what kind of services can we provide that haven't been possible before? And whenever looking at things like that, it's always worth looking into history a little bit. So most ideas that are big now, people had back in the Bitcoin days, but then it just wasn't viable for whatever reason on Bitcoin, usually because it got too expensive or it didn't scale or whatever. So, there's every cycle someone tries to do a tipping service, and probably now for the first time, tipping would actually, like from an economics perspective, work. Whether it's a big enough market is an open question. And so you often want to take a look at things that people have been exploring, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and think about like, okay, would this be possible now? And has someone tried to do it? And so that's kind of like maybe the approach I would take.
Got it. Thanks for sharing, some cool ideas and your, predictions on where things can go. Thanks, Teemu, for coming on this podcast. Really enjoyed chatting with you, and really excited to see, the mainnet of Gevulot, see some amazing use cases, and more importantly, in the Web3 world, have more PR and more, KOLs still Gevulot projects. So really exciting times. We wish you the best, and appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It was a pleasure.